So usually on my podcast, we focus on one family business at a time. This next guest has personally interviewed and mentored over 650 family business members from around the world. Today we're interviewing Martin Roll. He's a distinguished fellow of INSEAD University. He's the host of INSEAD University's Family Business Podcast, and he's a senior advisor for McKinsey's in the area of family business. Today we discuss how to deal with failure in a family business.
And maybe that could get some of them to shy away from it because the fear of failure, and you do not want to be the generation that's going to drive the business into the fence.
We also discuss how culture changes family businesses around the world.
Sometimes, for example, in Asian cultures, we have a little more respect for seniority and for the elders, people of power, people of titles, and all that.
All right, I'm Luke Hanson McDonald. This is Beyond the Family Business Podcast. Let's jump into it. Who are you? Where are you from? And what do you do?
I'm Martin Roll. I'm from Copenhagen in Denmark, and I'm a global family business and family office expert.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. And in this sometimes very niche world of family business, it's rare for me to get to talk to another family business aficionado and somebody with, I would say, a much more prestigious podcast than my own. So maybe you could quickly tell us what's the name of your podcast and the association with the university.
Yeah, outside my consulting life, I'm what you call a INSEAD Distinguished Fellow at INSEAD Business School, and I'm the editor-host of the INSEAD Family Business Podcast, which the audience can find on Spotify, Google, and different platforms and so forth.
Awesome. I'll put the link in the description. I think this is a more fair deal for me because your brand is very prestigious, so you're increasing my brand by association, whereas I hope I'm not tarnishing your brand by association.
No, on the contrary. Yeah, I think when it comes to the world of family business, isn't it one big family? So the more we learn from each other. So I'm more than happy to be on the podcast, and so I think it goes in both directions.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. So I'd like to start off with just asking, how did you get into this world?
I somehow sidetracked into the world of family firms. I originally were becoming a journalist, or thought I was becoming a journalist, but I ended up in business school. I was too young to become a journalist. Then I spent quite a few years in the marketing and advertising world before I came to Asia around 2000. And that really kind of segregated me into the world of family firms. I started to do more strategy and transformation work. And then suddenly one day, I got that call from a family owner that said, first of all, can you attend a workshop? Can you come into a board meeting? So somehow over time, I left my world of marketing and advertising and then started to do strategy and simply ended up in family firms. Probably something that we're going to get back to. It's very hard to pitch on a business family, right? You can't really call up the chair, the owner, the family, and can I fix your family? So it's it's kind of a world that you get invited into.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I feel where trust is so important, and there are, many people that take advantage of families and family businesses that people become very protective of themselves. So I think you're absolutely right, and it must mean that you have provided immense value for you to be invited into this world and to help so many families. So my hat's off to you.
Thanks a lot.
Because that's quite an accomplishment.
It's definitely about trust. I think it's also about word of mouth, because families talk to families, next gens talk to seniors, seniors talk to next gens, and somehow your name is starting to get cascaded around in the global circle somehow. There's another element to it. I don't think I could have done the same thing, let's say 15 or 20 years ago. I think there's a certain age element to it, because family business is not a topic. It's a compilation of topics, plus a fair deal of experience goes a very long way. Because I think when you advise and you work with families, there's so many things that you need to know, sometimes for context, sometimes for background, but sometimes very informally. But it all goes into the equation of trying to find a better tomorrow for the families.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So maybe that's a good segue into, one of the things you'd spoken to me about was the sheer number of families that you've mentored and that you've worked with, and especially next-gen leaders. You've had many one-on-one sessions. So first of all, how many next-gen leader mentorships or sessions have you had, and could you tell me a bit more about that process that you've gone through?
I mean, the hard number, plus minus, is at least 650 individuals that are spoken to one-on-one, probably in some 1,300 sessions, around 2,200, 2,300 hours. So that's quite a lot. I know a lot of people have done roundtables and circles, small seminars where you tend to have a few or more next-gens in the room, but most of the next-gen work I've done, aside from seminars and breakfast meetings, have really been a lot of one-on-one sessions. And I think when you get them one-on-one, it becomes a very private, it becomes a very trusted context, and next-gens really start to open up. The majority of the sessions I have done at INSEAD Business School, so of course has come with our academic offering. It is part of what INSEAD Business Schools offers to our students and alum, but I've also done a fair bit outside INSEAD. So it's really multicultural in all parts of the world, all types of businesses, all sorts of situations. But again, during the next session I would learn another situation because they're all different, right?
Yeah. And that must make your perspective. I mean, I can speak from experience where as a family business, you're often looking for an expert to provide you advice. But, as you said, a family business advisor or the topic of family business is a compilation of multiple different topics. So sometimes you'll get a lawyer or you'll get an accountant, but having, that very unique experience of sitting down with that many people must provide a very unique perspective you can't get elsewhere. I mean, the family businesses you work with must find that super valuable.
I hope so. They're still coming in and the business is solid, but I also started on the next gens, I would say, a little later in life, because my first part of the career track were, of course, to advise what you call the now gens or the senior generations. So obviously, when I speak to the next gens, because I don't take parts, or I also have to remind them very often there's a reason why your mom or your uncle or your family across generations have been very successful. And I think a good family business advisor speaks to both sides. I know what's cooking among the next gens, but I also have a very good take on what is happening with the senior generation. And if you look at the world of family business advisors, they tend to fall in maybe two parts, where you got a majority or a large part, which are what I call, tend to be a little more on the clinical psychology side, very much on the emotional, the dynamics and all of that. And then you have a set of advisors whom I think are a little more of a minority, which are coming from a management consulting side. And that's the size that I belong to. I have a very good psychological understanding and I have a good toolbox you need to have. But having been or being a management consultant, I think gives a certain advantage in terms of working with the senior gen and the families at large, because in the end, family business is about business. It is about the family, but in the end, no business, no family. So I think that has also given me a huge advantage in understanding business and management and leadership and those issues, aside from, of course, the entire box of all the family issues that you have to address as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess, playing on that idea of the importance of the family business, do you believe that there is a unique advantage that family businesses have over other businesses? And if so, what is that?
I think they do. First and foremost, because I think on the more philosophical level, family businesses have a stabilizing factor in the global economy. And why do I mean by that? Because they tend to have a little more of a long-term focus. Obviously, if you are listed, if you're part of the public market, you're a little more up for sale and buy and all that. But most business families do not build to exit. They tend to hold on to the assets for a very long time. And many business families have seen crisis in history. We have just had a pandemic, terrible one. But a lot of family business had maybe a little money in the cash account that could sustain the business, but they tend to have a much more of a long-term perspective. So that's a stabilizing factor. The other factor is that you got real people behind it. Yes, in a listed firm, of course, you got the pension funds and thousands or millions of shareholders, with all respect of that. But here you got a family, often by a name, who are behind the family business. So somehow they have their emotions, they got their hearts and the brain involved in it. So you got a very strong sense, a very strong force, what I call the entrepreneurial spirit behind the business. And that's a very strong force to keep the business relevant over time, but also to have that kind of long-term view. And maybe the final point out of many, family firms often come from somewhere. So you could come from the Midwest of the US and you have a lot of migrants that originally came from, let's say, the Chinese diaspora into Southeast Asia, for example, and they never forgot the roots. So they also tend to pay back to society, because sometimes there is a rag to riches story about coming from a very poor background, started on $100, and they really want to pay back to society after that. So I think you could almost look at all aspects. I mean, they're not perfect, but family firms, I think, contribute a lot to the global economy, and they have a lot of advantages compared to the listed firms.
No, that's very well summed up. And I often ponder this question of, I feel like family business is a high stakes game where there are these unique advantages, as you said, of long-term, view, the pride and the entrepreneurial spirit and, the lessons you learn from other generations, et cetera. But it also can go wrong very, very quickly. So could you maybe touch on, what you've seen as sort of the main challenges of family business, or the weaknesses that are also unique to family?
I mean, first and foremost, you're going to be relevant as a business. So obviously, if you become arrogant and complacent and you forget to innovate, there won't be a business tomorrow. So first of all, you have to be very sharp on your business story. You have to have a strong purpose, and you need to be super competitive. Just because you are family owned does not mean that you're shielded from market forces. So you're going to stay very, very competitive. Now, in order to succeed over time, transmission or succession is probably the most difficult thing. Because imagine at current times, you have a very strong, let's say, entrepreneurial founder, but how do you pass on the family business to the next generation? First of all, is there a next generation? Are you willing to step aside or to invite them in? Are they capable? Are they motivated? Is timing right? Are they old enough? Have they done something outside where you feel now that it's the right time to maybe over time gradually to pass over ownership and the legacy and the leadership in the business? And a lot of things can go wrong in that equation here. So that can be quite critical. You could have family fights. You could have lack of family dynamics. You could have conflicts within the family, because just because the family is a business family, it's not a given that it will actually succeed over time into the next generation. So a lot of things to observe in order for the family firm to succeed over the very long term.
So with that, and that's a great backdrop to my sort of next question, is what factors do you see most commonly as what allows for, that continuity of the family and the family bonds, over time and over generations?
I think the most important thing here is commitment to the business and to the legacy. And maybe a word to throw in here would be stewardship. Because often at times, of course, you need to focus on the current environment where the business is today. But in order to really create that bond is to make sure that everyone in the family, people that are in the business, people are not yet in the business, people who owns maybe part of the business, it doesn't have to be all family members, but everyone in the family needs to somehow have respective roles and also rally around the business family and the family business somehow. And this is where stewardship comes in, because stewardship somehow, I often call it a carefully curated balance between the past, present, and future. First of all, we need to understand where we are coming from. And it's not because, let's say, grandfather 2 or 3 generations ago had all the answers for tomorrow, but sometimes in that legacy, there are a lot of answers for tomorrow. Of course, we need to have a strong understanding of what we do today, but we also need to be able to maybe revitalize, maybe to innovate in order to be even better tomorrow. And this is where stewardship comes in. And that's what the family has to focus on. And that's why you need to build family unity, harmony through communication, through different vehicles of, let's say, governance and rules without being so rigid so everyone can't maneuver. And I think these are some of the most important traits when it comes to it. So really make sure that that the family knows why it is a family and business and not just a normal family because maybe they own these assets or companies and they have this kind of legacy to kind of safeguard. And that's super, super important that everyone see themselves in it, even though you might be a smaller equity holder, you may not yet hold equity, but you still see yourself as being part of a family. And I think that fosters unity and harmony over time. So everyone is invited. It's somehow creating this kind of inclusiveness so everyone feels they're part of it.
One of the really interesting things you said in there or interesting to me, is the idea of not being too rigid. And, every family is like, there's the common expression where you can choose your employees, you can't choose your siblings or, et cetera. And I think that is very true, that every family is going to have a different makeup of dynamics and interests and, experiences and capabilities. How do you think that works in a typical family, or what have you seen work effectively, I should say, in a family business where you do have some family members that maybe don't fit conventionally into the business, but still contribute to that stewardship or that overall, sense of being a family?
I think you somehow you can take on 3+1 different roles. The plus one is to run away and not to be involved. And you see that at times. I'm not interested, I'm not motivated, I don't want the family business to come in my way. But essentially the three major roles in a family firm for a family business member could be, you can either work in the business, be a CEO, be somewhere in the organizational grid. You can be part of the governance level, sit on the board, advisory board, committee, or you can be a responsible owner. Now, a responsible ownership also needs some kind of governance because you can't just own an asset. You need to have a bit of influence of the future as well. And this is where you need to look at the roles of families. So it doesn't mean that if you're an owner, you have to be involved. And sometimes maybe in the early years, you are involved, but you're not an owner yet. So you need to find roles for everyone in the family, and then you need to be ready to adapt, because a role for a 14-year-old who is only starting to learn that we are a business family, this is what we own, and there might potentially be a future for me. I also heard it maybe from some of the past generations, towards someone who is 40, 50, 60, very senior, sit on the board, maybe at the C-suite, maybe becomes a chair. What do I know of a large family business? Of course, your role would evolve over time. So it's important to have different journeys for different family members.
And with that, what are some of the most important ingredients as far as engaging that next generation and getting them pulled into the family business at any of those levels? But, as you said, there's always the other option of people decide to go their own way. They don't feel like they're part of the family. They don't want to be, et cetera. But I know personally from growing up in a family business, engagement has been a huge part of what's brought me into the fold. And you feel a certain loyalty when people trust you with information and stuff like that. So, what have you seen as key ingredients to engaging and successfully bringing in that next generation?
Take the mystery out of the equation. Often you find that business families, not until the teens or maybe in the 20s, will they talk to the next gens about what's really up here. So the best you can do in a business family is to talk about it early on. Of course, you don't talk to a 6-year-old the same way you will do to a 30-year-old, but take away the mystery, to be very open about that we are a business family. And it's always a balance between how much should I try to force my daughters to take on a journey inside the family or outside. Somehow you need to let your kids and the next gen somehow evolve over time. But make sure you communicate about it. Make sure you have a dialogue. Nurture your next gens to also go on with their lives in terms of education. Maybe they will start to work in the business during the summer holidays, at school or post-education. So somehow over time, maybe a journey for them will emerge. So you can never force the kids in, but you shouldn't be so abstract on the other hand, so they don't really see it as a journey. So you need to find a very fine balance between it, because if next gen's really going to take on the journey somehow, they need to have some kind of a mandate. And that mandate, I as a next gen cannot define until I know what is really ahead there. And that takes communication between the parties. And this is often the stumbling block, that we don't communicate between generations here. In the early years, you're not going to put too much pressure on the kids, but you're always going to keep the door open. Again, as I said, take the mystery out of the equation somehow to see there is a pathway, but it might be in the foreseeable future that you're going to educate yourself elsewhere, live in another country, work for another business or two, form your own views, get some experience, let the life journey start and begin. And then when it evolves over time, we're going to look at the different roles. So every, I would say, evolutionary path is different, but you're going to keep it, I would say, pretty flexible, but also committed in a sense, because it can't be that loose, or next gens aren't really sure. And I see that sometimes the next gen, they aren't really sure whether mom and dad and uncle and auntie actually want them back in the business because they haven't talked about it. So make sure you keep very open communication about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess specifically, what advice would you have for parents that, want to pull their kids in to the business? Is it really just talk to them early about it? Is it push them to get their own experience, or is it different with every next gen?
It's always different in any family because families communicate in different ways. You sometimes have different cultures. There could be gender aspects depending on where you are in the world. But I think the most important thing as parents is to be natural about being a business family. So at the early age, you might bring the kids on a business travel. You might bring them to the factory once in a while. They pop up in one of the meetings. And of course, in the early years, it has a bit more form of play. And just be very open about it. And of course, when you get maybe into your teens, where you start to talk about what's next, are you going to college or what you like to do in life? You also watch your kids because you can see what kids are inclined to do. And maybe they talk about certain things they want to do in life. So it is really keep that evolution going all the time. So kids feel like I can see a pathway ahead, but at the same time, I don't feel the pressure to come into it. It's just worth mentioning that, of course, parents and the senior generation always be very wary about whether to invite the next gens in, because in the end, you need to make sure, can I pass on the entrepreneurial spirit? Do my kids have that entrepreneurial burning flame? Because that is the most important thing. So yes, you're going to invite them, you're going to keep it open, but at the same time, you also need to see that your kids are stepping up and they are showing interest and motivation and capability, because otherwise it may not be for your kids to enter the business. So it's a kind of a critical juncture when you get to decision time, whether to invite them in or not.
Well, one of the things I've experienced in my own life is it's sometimes difficult to replace, in my opinion, that hardship that, the first generation of entrepreneurs went through, because that's what taught them so much. Quite often, like in my family, my father and my uncle didn't go to formal business school. They learned from the school of hard knocks, so to speak, and, made lots of mistakes along the way, but ultimately were very successful. And I have gone a much more conventional path of, going to school, and yes, I've got to work in organizations and, et cetera. But what would be your advice to parents or next generations as far as how do you replace that really true entrepreneurial struggle that often taught that first generation so much, when the next generation just simply can't go through that same, cycle? They're going to be on a different road than that first generation.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, that you don't try to replicate that your kids are going to do it the way that you did it, because that almost will lead to failure. It's important for any generation in any business to renew the firm, to put in some innovation, keep up with technologies and all that. But the way to foster that entrepreneurship, I think, is really to expose them to challenges early on, and to let them know that risk is not, and failure are welcome. We need to learn from it, get some real world experiences. If they fall, teach them to stand and see that there's a world out there where they can learn from that. So don't coddle them too much. Ask them to get some education outside, to work outside, maybe even start some venturing or entrepreneurship outside the business in the early years, simply just to get some life experiences while they are also starting to form their own opinions, their own identity, own personality. Because if they're going to join the firm, they are definitely going to renew it, but it may not be the renewal that maybe the senior generations brought to the business before them, because renewal always have a different phase in any generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think the part of that that really resonates with me is the importance of teaching people failure is not the end. It's actually sort of a key part of learning, and entrepreneurs implicitly know that you can't give up. Like the successful entrepreneurs, they take failure every day and then they keep going. And I feel like, certainly myself personally, I had a perception that you needed to do everything successfully, and that's how it worked. Because when you look at the history of your family, it looks like it was such a clear path. And one of the things that I've gone through and was a huge eye-opening experience for me is I have had some business failures in our family business. And my dad sat me down at one point and more or less said, you need to make a decision. I'm not going to judge you for whatever decision you make. You just need to make a decision. Like, don't get paralyzed by the fear of failure. You need to just realize that every day there's going to be things that work and don't work. And, the real key to success in business is that long-term tenacity of, don't give up, basically. And I think that was a bit of a turning point for me personally when I had that feedback, versus previously I was very much so of the mindset when I made a mistake, this is the end of my career. I'm not going to be worthy of my family, so to speak. So I think in my experience, that's sounds very similar to what
Also,
I've seen
because
as well.
as part of the next gen's deciding, and maybe this is different compared to 20 years ago, because 20 years ago there was one protagonist in the succession planning, and that were the senior generation. Nowadays, the way we teach it, the way we view it, is that succession is a successful construct of two protagonists, the senior generation and the younger generation. So on the younger generation side, they also going to decide eventually whether to join or not. And part of that equation is, do I dare to join? Because it's going to be some very big shoes to fill after my mom, my grandma, my dad, and so forth. And maybe that could get some of them to shy away from it, because the fear of failure, and you do not want to be the generation that's going to drive the business into the fence, because there is a big probability that you may not succeed. And maybe that burden of identity failure and driving the family into something where they shouldn't be could maybe refrain you from stepping up and getting into it. The good thing is you've seen all the work on psychological safety, which has really come about in the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, and over the last 5 or 10 years have somehow accelerated. And I think in that dialogue between different generations, psychological safety is super, super important, that we talk about failure, that we talk about risk, that we talk about you're going to learn as well, like the senior generations, they surely also learned after maybe their parents and other people in the family somehow. And having that open dialogue, I think, is super, super important. It's not getting any easier to join a family firm, because with the technology advancements and the pace of the world, innovation and disruption, it's hard to look at these kind of long-term circles. You know that families have a long-term view, but from a business point of view, you're going to be very competitive day by day. And of course, in that equation, next gens might ask themselves, do I dare to join? Can I really see myself taking on the business to do that? So you need to have a very open discussion about it.
No, I think that's absolutely great advice. And the one thing I always like to point out as well, or that I've had many discussions with my family about, is that my dad went through a very tough journey creating the business. But as he says, he had nothing to lose. He had started from zero, so everything was upside, which is a simplification because he worked unbelievably hard for a long period of time. But whereas I am one of a group, and if I screw it up, it's my fault versus the rest of the family. And so we've had some really good dialogue around that recently of like, how do we perceive that? Is that true? Et cetera. So anyway, I think you gave some excellent advice there. I just want to, paying attention to time, keep moving us along, and the question that I think is most interesting to me, because my perspective is so Canadian, North American. I get exposure to American families for sure through some of the networks I'm in and stuff like that. But it's very North American focused when it comes to family business. you have a very global perspective. You spend a lot of time in Europe, a lot of time in Asia, and elsewhere in the world. What are some of those key cultural differences you see with family business, around the world in those many conversations that you've had?
I mean, you have met one family, you have seen one family, but of course, and I often hear that family business is very different in different parts of the world. I have, for example, recently started to do a lot of work across Africa. Super interesting, because you have a large part of the businesses on the African continent being owned and controlled by families. And I often hear in all the new cultures that I'm getting into, well, you have to understand that family business here is very different. Now, I often tell people, and I've done it consistently over the years, that family business is the same thing. It's a bit like the operating system, like Windows. It's the same all over the world. Where it differs is culture. So if you do business in Asia, even within Asia, Asia has a lot of cultures. And as you said, Canada, North America, South America, Africa, you need to kind of look at cultures. And I mean, how is it different? It really depends on the context, because the way we communicate, for example, the notion of power distance. Sometimes, for example, in Asian cultures, we have a little more respect for seniority and for the elders, people of power, people of titles, and all that. Whereas if you go to my own neighborhood of Scandinavia and the Nordics, originally being a Danish citizen, you see that we have a little more of a flat hierarchy, and that means, of course, dialogue and communication in the family can still be tough. So what really comes in the way here is culture. And it could be worth looking at. We distinguish between low context cultures, where, for example, and that could be countries like Germany, United States, and Australia, where good communication is precise, simple, explicit, and clear. Messages are understood at face value. Whereas in high context cultures, it's much more sophisticated, nuanced, layered, and indirect. It's often implied. And imagine you have a discussion about joining the business. Those two different cultural contexts are very different, because in the high context culture, for example, Japan, Korea, India, and China, it's a little more layered, it's a little more nuanced, it's a little less verbal in many, many ways. It's a little more subtle in a sense. And you need to observe that when it comes to family firms. There's also the level of maturity. Obviously, a lot of firms, for example, in Europe are old. We have a lot of old family firms in Europe, like you have in the US as well. Whereas in Asia, a lot of the firms have come with the Asian industrialization over the last, let's say, 50 to 70 years, primarily after World War II. Of course, there are very old firms in Asia too. So a lot of the families in Asia are a little younger, probably sitting between maybe second and third generation. Whereas in Europe, it's not unusual to see families in the fifth or the 10th generation, and probably in North America, you sit maybe somewhere in between. And what does it mean? Mm-hmm. It means that the structure you have put around it, the governance systems, the professionalization, how formal have you become? How many rules have you done? How many outsiders would you have on your board? And this is simply a natural, probably evolution over time. So sometimes when it comes to cultures, it boils down to the very fact, how old are the family firms in a certain economy? And of course, some economies are more kind of emerging in the world, and then you have much more advanced and kind of old economies, for example, like the Canadian and North American economy. And often with that, over time, they have started to step up and professionalize the business in many ways, because they have been through succession. They have learned from the past. They have spoken to the peers, and somehow. It's also a question of how open you are as a family, as a culture. In certain cultures, we're a little more open, we're a little more expressive, we learn from peers. And in certain cultures, you tend to be a little more close, a little more secretive. We don't really share things with the neighbors and so forth. And of course, that would influence the way that you will see the family business evolve over time.
And do you see that there is any particular difference as far as when it comes to the collectivist nature of certain cultures, that's a lot more about the overall, group versus the individualistic natures, like in more capitalist markets, often that's sort of what you're taught in psychology, is that difference of individualism versus, collectivism. Do you see that having a big influence on the family business, or does that not really show up? As you said, it's more about the longevity?
I think it's an underlying factor. And of course, with the collectivist nature, for example, many Asian cultures, there's probably a little more expectation by the seniors to join or not to join. It's a little more peer pressure somehow. Whereas in the overall, I would say, more individualistic West, people are a little more left to decide whether to join or not. But you can still have the pressure. You can still have the sense of guilt. If I'm joining, I have guilt that I didn't do something else in life, and vice versa somehow. It exists in all cultures. But of course, with the collectivist culture, there's a little more pressure from within the family, from society, your surroundings. It's almost like you're bound to be part of this kind of business family. Whereas in the West, reaching out, doing something on your own, taking on risk, and somehow maybe is a little more accepted somehow. But in the end, what really governs that is really family relations and dynamics. So you can come from a very collectivist society, but you just have super good communication among the different generations, and you figure out what to do in your family. So I would say the elephant in the room very often is simply communication. And despite of society pressure or lack of it, you still get along very well. So that's probably the number one issue to look at. And of course, that can be complicated. Communication in certain cultures isn't that easy because of, the mom and dad, different roles, seniority, titles, wealth, respect, stature in society, and somehow sometimes it can be very hard to take on those very critical discussions as you get closer to decision time.
Okay, very, very interesting. And the last question I have, because we're running out of time here, is looking forward, in the current arena of the world today, there's a lot of things that are quickly changing, as you talked about, whether it's technology, the baby boomers retiring, et cetera. Are there unique challenges that family businesses have to look out for, going forward, or do you think this is really the same challenges that we've been facing for the last 100 years as family businesses go?
I think all in all, challenges are the same: to keep being vibrant and competitive, to get that professionalization going, to get, the formal governance structures, rules, succession planning, all of that. That's kind of textbook. It's always going to be there. Maybe, and we see that in certain cultures and parts of the world, it's getting a little tougher to get younger people, and young could be 20 to 50. So young comes at all different shapes, but to get them to join the family business, because first of all, younger people are in high demand. They're very well educated, better educated than the past generations. And sometimes for them to give up maybe a potential career outside could be a very, very daring consideration. So I think it's overall getting a little harder to kind of engage the next gens, at least to join the business. When it comes to ownership and being part of governance, that's a kind of a different question. So I think families need to work very, very hard on succession and really work very hard to understand what's really ahead for the next 20, 50 or 100 years, and why should we still be on family hands? Because you need to make sure that at least you attract the next gens in terms of stewardship and ownership and kind of long-term governance. So it's probably getting a little more challenging also because, as you said, the world is moving fast, technology upheavals, a lot of disruption going on. And the question that remains is, how can I fit into the family firm? The upside of that is having a family firm as an operating unit is also an incredible stepping stone for change and for innovation. It's much better to step into a family firm which is always running, where you can start to drive impact and you can help to change the world for the better, compared to maybe doing that outside. So you have like two flips of the coins here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that is the thing that I always toil with is ultimately if I go out and prove myself on my own, while it would feel very good and it's, often what society wants you to do, I've been given a very fortunate position that I'm in and I don't want to squander it either. So I think that's a very appropriate spot to end our conversation, and hopefully this is the first of many to come, Martin, because I've really enjoyed this. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
All right. I'm Luke Hanson McDonald. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Take care.